All right, welcome everybody. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi. I teach at UC Irvine, and we're really excited for the event today. What can Marxism teach us about Palestine and solidarity today? Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to pass over the mantle to the director of the Marxist Institute for Research, Joshua Clover.
Hi, everyone. Have I frozen? I'm worried I'm frozen on my screen. Okay, if it's not frozen for you, that's great. Welcome, everyone. I'm more the intern than the director, but it's nice that they let me give me that honorary title.
I think you are frozen, Joshua, but we can hear you fine.
Okay, that's fine. Let me click off my on and off my video and see if that makes a difference. Makes a difference for me at least. Anyway, welcome. I just want to mention a little bit about the Marxist Institute and a couple of upcoming events. The Marxist Institute is, in essence, just a mechanism for people who, in the UC system, extended universe, who make use of materialist method to be in contact with each other, to share research, knowledge, uh, camaraderie, friendship, and scholarly pursuits. We're in our third year. It's going fine so far. We hope to keep going for a while. We have two main activities, which is our speaker series and our summer seminar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both right now, but just a little because I want to get to our event. We have a couple upcoming speaking events I wanted to mention. On January 29th, our series, which is engaging with Marxist internationalism, which today's talk is obviously part of, continues with a discussion of Chinese Marxism featuring Rebecca Carl and our very young Wendy Matsumura. That's going to be at 5 o'clock California time. And there'll be details of that on our webpage and on our Twitter. I'm going to put both those links in the chat if I can figure out how to. Oh, I think I can possibly only send chats to the other seminar members, but I'm going to put them in there and hopefully they'll come up anyway. So that event is coming up in spring. We're going to be hosting a publication event for our comrade Jasper Burns's book, The Future of Revolution. That event will be both in person at UC Irvine and virtually on Zoom. You can also find information about that on our webpage when it's available and through our Twitter account. And finally, this is particularly for UC graduate students, but is actually open to everyone in the UC system, faculty, students, and staff. If you are part of the University of California community, with preference given to grad students, please feel encouraged to apply for our fully funded summer seminar, which is when we hang out in the mountains for about 5 days. We have seminars. They feature courses on capital with our core faculty. The annual Mike Davis lecture is going to be given this year by Andreas Malm, and there will be a 4-day seminar on climate Marxism given by our guest faculty, Alyssa Battistoni and Thea Rio-Francos. Alyssa, by the way, has an excellent new book forthcoming called Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature you may wish to check out. And here is the page I'm going to post in the chat for the summer seminar. Applications are open. They close in mid-January, and we'll make our decisions fairly shortly after that. It is, as I mentioned, fully funded. That includes not just tuition, but travel, food, lodging, and we hope you'll consider applying for it. Thank you very much for listening to the MIR spiel. Thank you again to our guest speakers and to Yusuf for putting this together. And with that, let me pass it back to the three of them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joshua. And it's really Joshua Clover, Annie McClanahan, and Charmaine Chua, who are three of the main people and brains behind the Marxist Institute for Research. So we really have their labor to thank for this magnificent space and the Institute and for events like today. So thank you very much to all of them, and especially to Charmaine, who really was the brains behind today's events. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers, and I should note that today's event is co-sponsored by the University of California faculty and staff for justice in Palestine. And our speakers today are Rafeef Ziadah and Adam Hanieh. Rafeef Ziadah is a senior lecturer in politics and public policy, emerging economies at King's College London. Her research focuses broadly on political economy, gender, and race, with a particular focus on the Middle East and East Africa. She holds a PhD in politics from York University in Canada. She's the co-editor with Brenna Bandar of the book Revolutionary Feminisms, out from Verso in 2020. And her research on infrastructures and maritime politics has appeared in Politics, Antipode, Conflict, Security and Development, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Environment and Planning D, among many other venues. She's also worked, as we all know, as a researcher and campaign organizer with a number of refugee rights and anti-poverty NGOs. Adam Hanieh is professor of political economy and global development in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, the University of Exeter. He's also a research fellow at the Transnational Institute and a member of the board of directors of the Middle East Research and Information Project, MERIP. His most recent book is Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, which is just out with Verso Press. So the title of today's event is What Can Marxism Teach Us About Palestine and Solidarity Today? And we're going to turn it over, I believe, to Adam Hanieh first, and then he'll be followed by Rafeef Ziadah. So warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, and thanks to everyone who is able to be on the call and the organizers, comrades, for bringing this event together. It's a real great pleasure to be here with you today. What I wanted to speak to tonight in about 20 minutes is to make an argument that the framework and concepts of Marxism are really essential for understanding what is going on in Palestine today. And indeed over the last century. And I mean this not simply in an analytical sense, but in a political sense, in terms of what we should be doing in our work in solidarity and building campaigns against the genocide today. And I want to set these remarks against what I see as three problematic ways of talking about and thinking about Palestine and Israel more broadly, and I think are very ubiquitous throughout both the left and also the solidarity movements. So these three dominant perspectives, the first is that Palestine is basically simply an issue of Israel's massive human rights violations that we see and read about on a daily basis. The violations of international law, the massive killings, arrests, dispossession that we have known now for approaching 8 decades. Now, obviously, these are all true, but I think framing Palestine through this lens of international law or through the lens of human rights and human rights abuses gets the question of Palestine fundamentally wrong. And I'll come back to why this is the case throughout this presentation. So that's the first perspective. The second is that the question of Palestine can simply be understood through a lens of looking through or looking at what is going on in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip or in Israel itself. A focus, in other words, on the personalities, the actions of the Israeli military, what's going on with the settlers and in the political institutions of these territories. I think this perspective, again, is very widespread. We tend to kind of hear Israel's actions explained through decisions, the personalized decisions of Netanyahu or Israeli leaders, and an attempt to understand what is going on simply through the lens of those areas. And then thirdly, and again, this is very widespread, that the reason Israel gets away with all of this, gets away with these human rights violations, is because of the massive influence of a so-called Israel lobby active in the United States and other Western states, that US policy is essentially driven by the actions of the Israel lobby in most Western states. So these three perspectives, as I said, are quite widespread in varying degrees. They are used, I think, very frequently in terms of understanding what is going on. What I want to argue is that the common problem with all these ways of thinking about Palestine is that they ignore the wider dynamics of the Middle East region, and the particular conjuncture of global capitalism that we are currently living. In other words, a moment where we can see interdependent realities of collapse, whether it be climatic collapse, economic or political, all around us. And I want to argue that the Middle East is really central to understanding this particular moment of global capitalism, and that it's not possible to think or to really comprehend the politics of Palestine today without this look at the wider regional scale. And to do so, we need to foreground concepts such as capitalism, imperialism, as well as the categories of class. These, I think, are essential to understanding the regional scale today. So I want to begin with looking at this question of how does the dispossession of Palestine connect to the forms taken by the capitalist world market across the 20th century. The first thing I would say here is that we need to situate Israeli settler colonialism and the more than 80 years dispossession of Palestinians in the Middle East's crucial place in our oil-centered world, and how that oil-centered world emerged from the mid-20th century onwards. I think it's quite extraordinary how much discussion of Palestine simply ignores this regional scale in attempting to explain the situation of Palestinians. Around the time of the Second World War, the Middle East became a key crucible of global politics because of two major transitions within the world system. The first of these was the shift to oil as the leading fossil fuel, a shift that sometimes described as the coal to oil transition. This is, I think, a misleading term in the sense that oil didn't supplant coal, but it was an additive process. It added on to coal as a principal energy source, becoming the major leading fossil fuel, and of course launching what scientists describe today as the Great Acceleration, the disastrous consequences that we are seeing in climate change across the world. So this is the first transition that I think it's really important to put forward, is this move to an oil-centered world order. And secondly, very much related to this, a second transition was the emergence of the United States as the dominant capitalist power, displacing older European colonial powers such as Britain and France within the world order. Now, these two transitions we need to see, I think, as very much interlinked and interdependent, in the sense that the Middle East was key to both of these transitions because it was the major site of the world's oil supplies outside of the United States and outside of the Soviet Union. And in this role, the Middle East underpinned this American-led oil to coal transition, firstly in Western Europe, and then later across the rest of the world. And most important here were the oil-rich Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia in particular, as well as the other smaller Gulf monarchies, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq. In this context, the United States replaced the older European colonial order by building alliances with these monarchies and guaranteeing their survival at a time of anti-colonial struggle and national liberation, national movements, and left-wing movements across the region as a whole. And the linchpin of this US alliance was Saudi Arabia. the site of the largest oil reserves in the world, and a key site of oil exports in this moment, post-World War period, immediately after the Second World War. Saudi oil supplies were under the direct control of the United States. And this Saudi-US alliance was a key pillar of American global power, and it remains so today. The second pillar of American power in the Middle East region was Israel. And this emerged particularly after the 1967 war, in which Israel destroyed the armed forces and political legitimacy of Egypt and other Arab states, and the wider, in the context of Arab nationalism and burgeoning movements for independence and left-wing struggles across the whole region. So from 1967 onwards, Israel became the core American ally in the region, backed by billions in military and financial subsidies, and even more importantly, as we can see today, in the political support that the United States gave to the Israeli state. Now, I think something that's often left out of this is that the key reason for this American alliance with Israel was Israel's character as a settler colonial state, founded on the ongoing dispossession of the Palestinian population. Settler colonies must continually work to fortify structures of racial oppression, structures of class exploitation, and dispossession. And as a result, they tend to be highly militarized and violent societies, which are reliant upon external support to maintain their material privileges in a hostile regional environment. And with a substantial proportion of settler societies benefiting from the oppression of indigenous populations and coming to understand their privileges in these racialized and militaristic terms, settler colonies tend to be much more dependable partners of Western imperial interests than normal client states. So this is, I think, evident from the very foundations of Israel in 1948 and the backing of, in particular, British colonialism at that moment. But as I said, after 1967, with the decline of British colonialism in the region, emergence of the US as the dominant power, Israel became a key ally in that post-1967 moment. So this, I think, is a really important point, because it points to how the internal character of the Israeli state, its class and racial character, is inseparable from its external support, the external support given to it by Western states, in particular the United States. American support for Israel is not incidental to the dispossession of Palestinians, but actually grounded fundamentally upon it. So this, I think, understanding this notion of settler colonialism, but particularly understanding it not simply in the context of what is going on inside Palestine itself, but within the wider architecture of Western imperialism, is, I think, essential to understanding the evolution of American power in the region. It's similar in many ways, I think, to the South African case, the South African apartheid case, and the similar connections that South African apartheid as a settler colony held with Britain and the United States up until the end of apartheid. So to recap these 2 points, the question of our fossil fuel-centered world order, fossil fuel-centered capitalism, is integrally related to US dominance in the Middle East and the dispossession of Palestinians. And secondly, the class and racial characteristics of Israel and the Gulf states are essential to understanding how they are located within US power. Now, why is this important today? It's important, I think, because over the last couple of decades, what we have seen is an attempt by the United States to knit together these two pillars, to knit together Saudi Arabia and the Gulf on one side, and Israel on the other, through the normalization of economic and political and diplomatic relationships between these two key pillars of American influence in the region. This is not something new. It's something that really accelerated after the Oslo Accords that Rafeef is going to speak about in a minute. And of course, it reached, if you like, a peak in 2020 with the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration, in which the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized their connections, relationships with Israel, as did a number of other states in the region. Now, understanding this strategy of normalization is, I think, really key to the current moment because of the relative decline of American power at a global level. And I want to deal here with just quickly a couple of misconceptions. I'm not saying that the United States is interested in controlling or owning or dominating the oil supplies in the Middle East. The Middle East oil is not currently under the control of Western companies. It hasn't been for a number of decades, and that's not going to change. Saudi Arabia's oil may, in the post-war moment, have been under the control of American oil companies, but today it is fully controlled by the Saudi state. Saudi Aramco is by far the biggest oil company in the world. Its profits are way in excess of the profits of any Western oil company, and that's not going to change. And likewise with the national oil companies in other Gulf regions. And secondly, this is not about the US relying on oil imports or needing oil imports from the Middle East region. The US is the largest oil producer in the world. It became so during the Obama administration, and it imports hardly any oil from the Middle East. Instead, and this is really a key point, the vast majority of the Middle East oil supplies go to China and East Asia. More than 70% of the oil from the Middle East region goes eastwards. And I think this last point is key to understanding why the normalization of Israel and Saudi Arabia, bringing together these two pillars, is so central to American imperial interests at the current moment. The US is attempting to pull the Gulf states out of closer ties with China and find a way to re-embed American primacy in the region as a whole. It is quite conceivable, for example, that in the event of any heightened conflict between the US and China, that the US would attempt to impose sanctions on China and an energy embargo through this kind of its influence in the Middle East region. And this is not just about oil as a material substance. It also relates to the dollar-denominated nature of oil as still the world's most important commodity. So the overarching point is that there are very material interests, very material reasons why the Middle East is so crucial to American imperial interests at the moment, and thus why Israel remains the leading US ally in the region. There's a lot more that can be said about the kind of nature of regional capitalism in the Middle East over the last couple of decades. There's important points to make about the way that many Arab states, in particular Egypt and Jordan, since the 1980s have undergone quite deep-seated neoliberal reform, opening up their economies through this period, through the policies that we're familiar with. And one of the consequences of that was the internationalization of Gulf-based capital Gulf investors throughout the wider region, becoming very importantly embedded in the class structures of places like Egypt and Jordan, in particular, through the ownership of assets and investments. So the 2011 Arab uprisings were in large part a response to that process of neoliberal reform. And I think thinking about today's politics in the context of those uprisings is also important, because what they did, they may have overthrown individual autocratic leaders such as Mubarak in Egypt or Ben Ali in Tunisia, but these uprisings didn't fundamentally challenge the class structures of the region. They didn't fundamentally challenge capitalism and across the region. And in particular, I think there's a problem with a lot of the kinds of ways that the left in the region thinks about capitalism and tends to subordinate itself to national bourgeoisies or national capitalist classes. So I just as an aside here, I want to say that obviously not all states in the region are embedded in this kind of American project in the same kind of way. States like Iran, for example, clearly do not sit within the US orbit. But I do think we need to be careful while obviously opposing any kind of imperial intervention or sanctions or attacks on Iran, to be clear that the Iranian regime and its national bourgeoisie does not represent a progressive alternative or any way out of the current predicament, as the workers' movement and the left in Iran know too well. So I just want to wrap up in my final minutes with some political conclusions. I've tried to emphasize why I think we need to de-exceptionalize Palestine and Gaza today. It's not possible to understand what is happening without this wider regional lens and situating the Middle East in broader dynamics of global capitalism. And to do that, we need to understand what capitalism is, questions of class dynamics, accumulation, and so forth. And this is why I think the struggle in Palestine is so crucial to any kind of anti-imperialist politics today. And it's all the more so given the multiple crises that do face capitalism. And I think most importantly, and I really want to emphasize this point, we need to see Palestine, because of this regional lens, as a climate issue. Many people talk about Palestine being a question of ecocide, for example, because of the enormous destruction that's going on in the Gaza Strip, of the ecology of the Gaza Strip, or another point that's often raised at the moment is the gas reserves that are natural gas reserves that are off the coast of Gaza under Israeli control. Now these are true. These are important questions to think about. But these are not what make Palestine a question of the climate. There is no way to dismantle fossil capitalism at a global scale without actually tackling the place of the Middle East, and in particular the position of the Gulf states in the global economy. And as I've tried to say, this is deeply connected to the place that Israel plays in ensuring American dominance over the region. It also is important, I think, to push back against some of the muddle-headed and I think, frankly, quite dangerous ideas about the Israel lobby, as if what I've tried to say tonight is actually the relationship between Israel and the United States is the other way around. It's the US that is driving the genocide, is the US that is arming the genocide, is the US that is financing the genocide, and most importantly, as we can see today, it is the US that is playing the ideological role on the world stage in allowing the genocide to continue. So it's really, I think, crucial to understand this relationship the right way around. It is not about an Israel lobby determining or running US policy or any other Western state. That's a fundamental liberal perspective of understanding it. So I'll end on the point that solidarity means, I think, foregrounding these questions that I've noted, tackling the regional dynamics. It is not simply about what is going on in Gaza. It's about looking at the broader inequalities across the regional scale. The Middle East is the most unequal region in the world. It is the place where you have enormous amounts of wealth existing in the Gulf states, in Israel, alongside the poorest states, literally Gaza and Yemen, the poorest areas in the region. It also means foregrounding other moments, for example, the situation in Sudan, situation in Yemen, the situation in Iraq, where we see levels of dispossession, levels of famine at the same scale that we are seeing today in the Gaza Strip. So understanding these regional dynamics as being fundamentally connected and part of the same struggle is, I think, really important in building solidarity today against the genocide. So I'll end it there. And again, thank you to comrades very much for allowing us to present tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we turn it over to Rafeef Ziadah, I'll just mention that for all of the people in the audience, you can feel free to start putting your questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window at any point, and we'll field those at the end when we turn to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, for that very kind introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for putting this event on. I can see many comrades and friends in the list of attendees. I'm sad we're not having this event in person. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to step back slightly from the day-to-day organizing and think a little bit more analytically about the current moment. I want to start by being honest, though that's incredibly difficult under current circumstances. For all of us Palestinians, we have lost so many friends and comrades and mentors, more than we can bear to even count in the past year and something now. So please bear with me as I try to have these conversations and try to put the framework of what is happening today in kind of a larger context, following from what Adam was just talking about. And I'll start in a slightly odd place, which is Netanyahu's Twitter feed. Many people missed this, but on May 3rd of 2024, Netanyahu put out a tweet that was about a vision for Gaza 2035. For a lot of us who study the Middle East region, we see a lot of these grand visions, Saudi 2035, UAE 2035. And this vision, in the middle of a genocide, looked very much like those other visions that we often study. It was a three-phase master plan aimed at integrating Gaza into the regional and political economy. It stressed that Gaza has a historically central location on key trade routes, and it should be leveraged for industrial development, trade, and cooperation. Now, behind this rhetoric, of course, of modernization, there was a very clear and deep vision of economic normalization and trying to tie Israel to its strategic allies within the region. So Netanyahu's tweet was not exactly about an economic announcement, but it really revealed deeper mechanisms of normalization, a strategy which profoundly will implicate Palestinians, but also the broader Middle East region. Now, we need to analyze and understand this process because it really pushes us to go beyond the liberal frameworks of a two-state solution or two equal sides that just need to sit at a table and negotiate, and actually understand the underlying political economy of the region, but also questions of class and imperialism and how they're being constructed. So let me say a little bit about this plan. The core of the Gaza 2035 plan was to establish a free trade zone. They mostly do. This would be the Gaza Arish Sidrot free trade zone that will link this entire area. Gaza would serve as an industrial port on the Mediterranean, linking the region to global markets through railways, pipelines, and shipping routes. The free trade zone would focus on industries such as manufacturing, energy, and trade logistics. Now, what would happen in the interim is, under the auspices of the Abraham Accords, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, and Egypt would step in to help Gaza and deliver humanitarian aid into safe zones that Israel designates, while eventually Palestinians are integrated into the Abraham Accords for full integration into this new regional order. The plan clearly said they will be, and I put in quotes, rebuilding Gaza from nothing and building new cities from scratch. One of the ideas, of course, is to link Gaza into other mega projects in the region, including NEOM in Saudi Arabia. Now, what would be the benefit of this for the Gulf states? The plan emphasizes that the economic advantages for Gulf states would be that they would get unfettered access to the Mediterranean ports through pipelines and railways going through Gaza. With this aligns, of course, with the broader regional strategies that we have heard from the United States in particular for a very long time about a new Middle East that is based on ideas of, and I put this in quotations, economic peace, where there is economic integration across the region, with Israel being a key pillar of this integration. So what Adam was speaking about earlier in terms of the two key pillars of US imperialism in the region being Gulf states and Israel, we see here very much a way that they would be connected very materially, physically through these infrastructures. There's a lot of talk in the plan about building an electric vehicle manufacturing hub. So that's what Gaza would become. And of course, this would be in order to compete with Chinese EV production, and a big emphasis on greenwashing, things like building solar energy fields, desalination plants, and gas fields that would benefit the energy circuits within the region. So for those of us who study the political economy of the region, this plan has everything, has the stamp of every other plan that we see. Neoliberalism, greenwashing, mega projects, all intertwined into one. And this plan might at first sight look to us extremely vulgar. What it's based on is essentially thinking of Gaza as a blank slate, thinking that there is no one there, and that it has to be rebuilt from scratch, as they say. That is the assumption behind this plan. But the other key assumption is that there can be economic solutions rather than political solutions. And again, this is at the core of the US New Middle East vision that has been being pushed well before the current genocide. It was being pushed during the war on Iraq and even before then. The idea that you can have economic solutions and economic integration without any political solutions, this means ignoring the Palestinian right of return, ignoring the siege on Gaza, ignoring the illegal occupation, and just thinking of how to integrate Palestinians into the region economically. This, of course, depends on thinking of Palestinians as a cheap labor force, where Gaza's potential role, even as an electric vehicle manufacturing hub, really lies in the Palestinian population that lives there, using them as a captive, cheap labor. So this is normalization without liberation. The integration of Gaza into regional frameworks like the Abraham Accords would seek to bypass Palestinian demands for self-determination altogether. This is Palestinians, essentially a vision of Palestinians being defeated in Gaza and then being accepting of a Bantustan solution. And again, while this plan may look really vulgar to us in the current moment, If we just think back to the Oslo Accords, signed and celebrated as a peace agreement under the auspices of the United States, they had a similar vision of economic peace with limited Palestinian self-rule. And here I want to stress, as per the conversation we're having today around Marxism, is sometimes I'm quite surprised that people who on a daily basis analyze neoliberalism, talk about the category of class, when it comes to Palestine, that kind of analysis stops. And we start to rely on much more liberal frameworks. If we think about Oslo and the political economy of Oslo, then we really have to think through Marxian categories of class, settler colonial capitalism, and imperialism in order to analyze the conditions that exist today and how we got to this stage. So allow me a little bit of time to get through the Oslo Accords very quickly and the political economy of them, because I don't think there's actually enough deep discussion of how they operate. So the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. They marked the end of the First Intifada. You saw the return of the Palestinian Liberation Organization leadership from exile into a state of self-rule and self-governance. The Oslo Accords focused on limited territorial self-rule, mainly in the West Bank and Gaza, and largely ignored larger Palestinian questions. Again, the right of return was put on a back burner. Access to water was put on a back burner. Palestinian refugees and Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are the majority of Palestinians, their demands were put off to the sideline. The Oslo Accords split the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. This was area A was the smallest of the three, and it made up 3% of the West Bank. And this was the only place where the Palestinian Authority had control. Then there was Area B. This made up 24% of the West Bank and housed 70% of the Palestinian population. This was under joint control with Israel. And Area C, the largest area, making up over 70% of the West Bank, remained under full Israeli control. So the Oslo Accords that were touted as this peace for Palestinians and future of statehood essentially left the majority of the land, even of the West Bank, under Israeli control. This division of the West Bank was not an accident. It was designed to fragment Palestinian communities into isolated enclaves. Meanwhile, of course, as most of us know, Israeli illegal settlements grew rapidly in that period. Most of the settlements were on hilltops, taking charge of much of the water of the West Bank. Now, the part about the Oslo Accords that people often don't speak about is the economic side, which is the Paris Protocol. The Oslo Accord process made the Palestinian economy heavily dependent on Israel. The 1994 Paris Protocol, which is often overlooked in analysis, played a big role in this. It linked the Palestinian economy directly to Israel through control over trade, control over taxation, and control over how it negotiated with external markets. This meant that the Palestinian Authority became reliant on tax revenues, which Israel withholds. So currently, Israel is withholding tax revenues. That's why the finances of the Palestinian Authority are near collapse. And what this did is it created a trade dependency. About 80% of Palestinian imports come from Israel, making Palestinians dependent on Israeli goods, something that Palestinian political economists, including some with us on the chat today, have analyzed as a captive economy. What this also means, if we take this a step further, is that much of the aid that the Palestinian Authority receives actually ends up in Israeli coffers, because Palestinians, once this aid is directed at them, are actually buying products from the Israeli economy. So when they say a place like Gaza, for example, is one of the most aid-dependent places on earth, the conclusion of that is actually the majority of this aid ends up in Israeli coffers because Palestine is a captive economy. Just a few practicalities on the Paris Protocol and what it did. It linked Palestine and Israel in a customs union. So Palestinian trade was subsumed under Israel's customs regime. All imports and exports passed through Israeli-controlled ports, with Israel determining tariffs and trade terms. Palestinian goods required Israeli approval for export, while Israeli goods flooded the Palestinian market without any restrictions. Imports from third countries faced Israeli-imposed tariffs. This, for example, is very important when we think of pharmaceuticals. So Palestinians are not allowed to get pharmaceuticals at rates that they would in countries like Jordan. They have to go through Israel, where the rates are much higher. Besides the customs union, there was also monetary and financial integration. So there was the adoption of the Israeli shekel. There is no independent Palestinian monetary policy. There was, of course, control over movement and labor. Israel maintained military control over borders, restricting Palestinian access to markets, resources, and employment. If you look at Netanyahu's plan that I started with, it's actually not a very different template than this Paris Protocol template. The one thing that might be slightly different about it is that now, because of climate change, all of these policies seem to have a lot more greenwashing built within them than maybe at the time of the Paris Protocol. So they'll speak about solar plants or EVs a little bit more. But the mechanism of control, the idea of thinking of Palestinians simply as cheap labor and as captive within Bantustan hasn't really changed. The Gaza Strip, through this Oslo Accords, really exemplified the economic devastation. While the PA exercised limited governance in Gaza, Israel's maintained control over borders, airspace, and the flow of goods. Following the 2000 political split between Hamas and Fatah, Israel imposed, of course, the severe blockade on Gaza, crippling the economy completely and increasing reliance on foreign aid. Gaza was kept in a state of controlled collapse and ensured to be dependent on Israel. And this process started way, way before a year ago. Adam and I had been part of a study about the impact of COVID on workers within Gaza, and the findings that were during COVID were already devastating of the economic conditions of Gaza. Everyone who studies Gaza knew that there was going to be a point where the population there was not going to be able to endure the blockade and endure the occupation much longer. But what this framework did was it fragmented and deindustrialized even the West Bank and Gaza. There was a destruction of any productive sector in the economy, particularly agriculture and manufacturing. Manufactured goods could not compete with Israeli goods from the Israeli markets. Farmers were not allowed access to their land, and even if they had access to their land, they could not ship or export their products. So many people became dependent on the Israeli economy. The Palestinian economy became both a captive market and fully dependent on external aid that, as I just said previously, would circulate back into the Israeli economy. Now, one has to also say that this happened in the context of deep neoliberal policies by the Palestinian Authority that were shaped by international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They endorsed privatization and deregulation. These policies, of course, deepened inequality within Palestinian society and failed to address underlying structural imbalances. And here I want to stress the inequality within Palestinian society, because often people speak about Palestinians without actually analyzing Palestinian lives, Palestinian class structure, or changes that happened to Palestinians during the Oslo Accords, as if it is one society where the categories that we use to analyze do not apply. But what I want to argue is that it's extremely important to recognize the inequalities that happened through Oslo and what they did to Palestinian society in terms of fragmenting society geographically, but also attempting to fragment it politically. One of the things that happened, aside from the privatization and deregulation, was, of course, a major expansion of the Palestinian Authority security sector. Under Oslo, the PA established a robust security sector tasked and with maintaining what was called internal order and security cooperation with Israel. That security cooperation, of course, continues in the West Bank to this day. This was largely funded by donors, and it was actually the largest part of the Palestinian Authority budget. So increasingly, the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in the West Bank was losing any legitimacy and increasingly seen just as the face of the Israeli occupation, just as the Palestinian face of the Israeli occupation. And here we saw a deep fragmentation of the Palestinian labor market, of course. The Paris Protocol economic framework fractured the Palestinian labor market, creating highly exploitative employment patterns across three main sectors. One was, of course, the Israeli-controlled labor market, where Palestinian workers, mostly young men, dominated low-wage jobs in Israeli construction and agriculture. While wages were, of course, higher than they would have been if they worked in the Palestinian economy, the conditions were highly exploitative. And there's an entire story around permits and work permits that I don't have a chance to get into today. The other large sector of employment is, of course, the public sector with the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority becomes a really significant employer within the West Bank and Gaza, also in highly feminized sectors, including nursing, including teaching. So a lot of the transfers of taxes that Israel is withholding, they would be essentially going to pay the wages of these workers. And again, what most people don't talk about is that even in the last period, most wages for these PA employees have been cut. Most of them are not actually getting any payments or 30% of their paycheck. Just to put this in more concrete terms, if you are a school teacher and you are getting paid $300, now you're not even making that much to sustain your entire family. And of course, the other large employer, aside from the Israeli market and the public sector, was the private sector, where we saw an epidemic of informal labor, dominated with few workers, mostly in the service sector, that had very few contracts. And again, this is not a very strange story of neoliberalism and how it operates, except here it is operating under a context of settler colonialism and an external power that is enforcing the destruction of the economy, coupled with international financial institutions, which are constantly demanding austerity and security and linking austerity and security together. Of course, under this framework, and especially with the devastating blockade on Gaza, unemployment was endemic. Unemployment rates in Gaza before the last war overexceeded 45%, with youth and women particularly affected. Youth unemployment levels were actually some of the highest in the world. Low labor participation rates, especially among women and mostly university educated women, were extremely high, again, well before the genocide, where Gaza was left in a state of controlled collapse. So where does this leave us today? With the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the Oslo Accords came under intense pressure, of course. And after years of a kind of stalemate between Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, where the violence against Palestinians was constant and ongoing, devastating Palestinian life, but was not flashing on international TV screens, there was another process happening of trying to have normalization and another Oslo, but this time without Palestinians. To put it even more bluntly, Palestinians in Gaza in particular were seen as too troublesome for this kind of economic peace, and the idea was to ignore them altogether and have the Abraham Accords, again hosted under the auspices of the United States, that could link the two pillars of US policy together, as Adam was referring to. The Abraham Accords were signed in 2020. These were the first such agreements since the one with Egypt in 1979 and the one in Jordan in 1994. The Abraham Accords included several major components: political recognition, diplomatic recognition, economic cooperation, security collaboration, and cultural exchanges. By 2023, the United Arab Emirates had around 1,000 Israeli businesses operating within its borders. A major deal saw the Emirati Sovereign Wealth Fund purchase a 22% stake in Israel's Tamar gas field for $1 billion. The UAE became a significant investor in Israeli high tech, with firms like Abu Dhabi's based G42 opening offices in Israel. I could go on and on about the collaborations that took place and the economic ties that have taken place between the United Arab Emirates and Israel in the past years. One thing to note is that even through this genocide, the Abraham Accords have held. They haven't been overturned. The United Arab Emirates still insists that because of the Accords, it's able to have access to Gaza. And what we see, if we look at normalization and these processes of so-called economic peace, is that they are now broadening as well. So during the 2023 G20 summit in New Delhi, leaders signed a memorandum of understanding to develop what is called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC. And this would aim to have transport routes that integrate Israel further into logistical networks. The initial memorandum of understanding was signed by the US, the European Union, France, Germany, Italy, India, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and it envisioned two sections: an eastern maritime link between India and the Gulf, and a northern section that would connect the Arabian Peninsula to Europe. These would be connected by new railway networks to link the Gulf with the Mediterranean via Jordan and Israel. Beyond the transport infrastructure, undersea cables would facilitate the exchange of data, while long-distance hydrogen pipelines would boost the participants' climate and decarbonization goals. As I said, now it seems these deals all need to include some greenwashing elements. This initiative supposedly is meant to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. And despite challenges being posed by China to influence the region, this is the US counter. These kind of major logistical infrastructural initiatives are meant to counter that, again, linking Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE even more closely. Now, as any of us who have looked at these infrastructural projects, this doesn't mean that most of them come to life. A lot of them don't get finished. But it's important to understand the economic visions behind them, these ideas of normalization. So this is about normalization without Palestinians. This is to circumvent Palestinian liberation altogether. This is to erase Palestinians. And this is to separate economics and politics and assume that you can have an economic solution. And if you hear now with the Trump administration, the way they speak about the region, it's all about making a trade deal, as if Palestinians are inhuman and don't even exist in this logic. So to close, I just want to say that in order to confront this, to confront the stark normalization that bypasses Palestinians, we really need to analyze it and understand it. We cannot bypass Palestinians. The whole idea of this type of normalization is to erase Palestinian demands for justice and liberation. So these are not just a series of agreements or economic ventures. It is a systemic reconfiguration of regional dynamics. And they're not just about Palestinians either. We need to consider Sudan, we need to consider Yemen, we need to consider the inequalities at a regional scale, as Adam was just saying. This reality underscores the necessity for solidarity to actually be rooted in clear-eyed analysis. Solidarity with Palestine must grapple with these economic and political structures, understanding normalization as a tool of domination, and the Palestinian economy as a site of both resistance and exploitation. To merely call for justice or liberation without actually engaging in this deeper analysis really risks solidarity becoming very superficial. And if we are to stand meaningfully with Palestine, our work must include practical research and action. I'm saying this here because I know many people on this call are academics and activists. There is a lot of work to be done in tracing these economic networks. There's a few researchers doing this work, but really also for the movements, we need deep investigation and analysis of the multinational corporations, the state actors, the regional alliances that are profiting from Palestinian oppression. We also need to highlight Palestinian exploitation and the lives of Palestinians, where solidarity is not simply symbolic, but takes seriously Palestinians as agents of their own liberation. Unpacking how Palestinians are positioned as pools of cheap labor and documenting the conditions of Palestinian workers. And finally, scrutinizing how US interventions and frameworks such as economic peace are basically mechanisms of pacification and control. Normalization without Palestinians is not just a betrayal of Palestinian aspirations, it is a reconfiguration of the Middle East that seeks to erase us altogether. Our task is to resist this erasure. We have to do that intellectually, politically, and practically by understanding the material realities of Palestinian political economy and the mechanisms of normalization. We equip ourselves to act effectively in solidarity with those struggling for a free and a just Palestine. Thank you.